Welcome to the Classic Soap Operas podcast, where we explore the twists, turns, and transformations that shaped the world of soap operas. Today's deep dive takes us back to a moment of major media change, the 1950s shift from radio to television, and how the guiding light, with the help of Procter and Gamble and a fiercely loyal audience, managed to survive and thrive in a whole new medium.
Welcome to the deep dive, where your curiosity fuels our exploration.
Indeed.
Today, we're jumping into a really fascinating bit of media history. We're looking at how the soap opera guiding light made the leap from radio all the way to television back in the 50s.
Yeah, and we got some great source material for this industry. Magazines like Sponsor, fan stuff like Radio Mirror, some really good analysis too.
It's a fantastic case study, isn't it? Guiding light ran for so long across both. It gives us a unique window into that whole media shift.
Exactly. And we're going to explore this transition through, well, mainly two lenses today.
Okay.
First, the money side. Specifically, the huge influence of the sponsor Procter & Gamble.
Right, P&G.
And second, how the relationship between the show and its very dedicated audience changed with the move to TV.
And we should probably remember up front, soap operas weren't exactly considered, high art back then.
Not at all. They were often seen as a bit inferior,
Huh.
partly because the audience was mostly women and, well, the obvious advertising connection.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so let's dive in. Where does the guiding light story actually begin?
It kicks off in 1937. Radio, CBS.
Created by Erna Phillips.
The one and only, a real pioneer of the whole genre. And almost right away, it gets this massive boost from Procter & Gamble.
P&G again. They were huge in radio advertising then, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely dominant. They sponsored Guiding Light very early on, pushing products like Does Detergent,
Classic.
Ivory Soap, Crisco,
Yeah.
household staples.
Makes sense. Soap operas were basically built for advertising, that kind of stuff. You had this captive audience day in, day out.
Exactly. Though, funnily enough, the networks initially sort of underestimated the housewives' attention span. Didn't think they'd listen closely to ads while doing chores.
Really?
Yeah, so the daytime ad rates were actually lower, which of course made it even more appealing for sponsors like P&G selling affordable household goods.
So the products advertised soaps, cleaners, appliances. It all just reinforced that idea. This is for housewives.
Completely. It was a perfect fit. And there's this big agency, Blackett Sample Hummers.
Oh, yeah.
They produced a ton of these radio soaps, even some of Erna Phillips's early ones, like Painted Dreams.
Wow. Okay, so that's the radio scene set. Established sponsor, loyal listeners, pretty cost-effective.
Right.
Then along comes television. How did P&G handle that shift, especially the cost?
Well, TV was a whole different ballgame, financially speaking. We're talking maybe 2-3 times the cost of radio.
Ouch.
P&G had actually tested the waters a bit earlier with a TV show called The First 100 Years.
Okay.
So when Guiding Light went to TV in 52, they did this dual broadcast thing. Same show, radio and TV simultaneously. Ran like that for 4 years.
Kind of hedging their bets, easing into the expense.
Pretty much. It let them keep the radio audience happy while building a TV presence.
Yeah.
A really key cost saver during that time was using the same production team.
Makes sense.
And, crucially, the exact same scripts for both versions.
Wow.
But they knew they couldn't totally ignore the vision part of television. So, interestingly, they decided to film the commercials for TV.
So the ads were treated differently.
Yeah, it was more cost-effective for ads, with reruns and reuse. But the actual drama part of the show, that stayed live on TV, initially at least.
Live TV every day for a soap opera. That sounds intense.
Oh, for sure. You see articles in Sponsor magazine back then talking about the problems of a TV soap opera.
Like what?
Things like, how do you slot the film's commercials into the live show smoothly? And actors needing memory aids, like the teleprompter became essential.
Right.
There was definitely some nervousness from sponsors venturing into TV. It was expensive, kind of unknown territory.
Yeah.
They really had to prove it was worth the extra cost.
Yeah.
That it was having an impact.
Everyone's scrambling to figure it out. What about Erna Phillips herself, the show's creator? Was she keen on TV from the start?
Actually, no, not really, at least not initially. There's this letter she wrote in 1948 to a P&G exec, William Ramsey. And she basically said, look, unless TV figures out a way for housewives to follow the story mostly by listening, without needing to constantly watch, she didn't see daytime TV serials taking off anytime soon.
Huh. That's surprising, given her later success.
It is. She even talked about commercials, suggesting they should be woven into the story visually, not just announced separately.
So she was thinking about the medium, but maybe skeptical about the audience's viewing habits.
Exactly. But, as Alana Levine discusses in her stories, while that letter shows her hesitation, other evidence suggests Phillips was thinking ahead, innovating for TV soaps quite early on.
So maybe more complex than just being anti-TV.
Definitely. She was clearly wrestling with how to make it work for her specific audience, the homemaker.
Okay, so despite those early doubts, Guiding Light did become a big hit on TV.
Oh, yeah. There's a graph in Sponsor from April '55 showing it as a top daytime serial.
That must have boosted confidence.
Absolutely. Gave them a sense of security, enough that they started talking about maybe filming the whole show.
Really? Did they?
Well, eventually they went to videotape, much later. But the fact that filming was even on the table shows they felt more solid about TV. But remember, back then it was still just exteriors and those commercials being filmed.
Gotcha. And P&G's overall strategy, were they shifting focus away from just daytime?
Yeah. By '55, you start to see their ad budget spread out more evenly.
Yeah.
Daytime TV was still important, but primetime TV was getting a bigger slice of the pie.
Makes sense. TV was growing, reaching more people at different times.
Exactly. They were broadening their marketing focus.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit. Let's talk about the audience. They'd known these characters just as voices for years. What happened when they could suddenly see them?
That was a massive change. Visibility. Radio actors had, a level of anonymity.
Right.
TV put faces to the voices. It completely shifted the audience's relationship with the performers.
And the fan magazines must have loved that.
Oh, totally. Magazines like Radio Mirror became really important. They kind of bridged that gap between the show, the actors, and the fans.
What kind of stuff did they publish?
It was this really interesting mix of fiction and reality. Like they'd have illustrated stories based on the radio plots. There was one called A Guiding Light Story, Will You Be Waiting? About Trudy Bauer.
Okay.
The drawing was super romantic, like a novel cover, but didn't necessarily look like the actress voicing Trudy.
So adding visuals to the radio story.
Exactly. But they also covered the drama. A story about Meta Bauer's trial, A Reason for Living, had much more serious illustrations.
Right.
But what gets really interesting is how they started blurring the lines.
Oh, so?
Well, there was a feature called A Present for Michael, supposedly written by the character Bertha Bauer, but it had a photo of the actress Charita Bauer holding her on-screen baby.
Ah, okay. Merging character and actor.
Totally. Then another article, Charita's Guiding Light, showed her with her real sons and her on-screen son. It was all about making the actors relatable, familiar.
Kind of the birth of modern soap opera celebrity coverage, maybe.
Pretty much, yeah. Laying that groundwork. Interestingly, the actual end of the radio version in '56 seems kind of muted.
Really? No big fanfare?
Apparently not. Radio Mirror even had conflicting dates for when it stopped. Charita Bauer, who played Bertha, was reportedly quite sad about it ending, the end of that dual broadcast era.
I bet. Must have been a big shift for the actors, too, right? Going from mostly voice work to being on camera.
Huge. TV demanded more commitment. You started seeing longer contracts as the networks figured out which actors really clicked visually with the audience.
Now, there was always that criticism, wasn't there? That radio soaps were just, background noise for housewives.
Yeah, that perception was definitely out there.
But then you hear about Guiding Light getting 75,000 letters early on when it was almost canceled. That doesn't sound like background noise.
Not at all. That shows real attachment, real loyalty. The audience was deeply connected, despite what some critics said.
So the sponsors must have known that on some level.
Oh, they did. There was this idea called the uplift approach in advertising.
Uplift?
Yeah, the thinking was if you entertain the audience, keep them hooked on the drama, they'll be more receptive to the ads. Keep them happy, they'll listen to the pitch.
Makes sense. But did that view of the audience change as TV took over?
It did, yeah. And you start seeing these anxieties about changing gender roles creeping in, post-war America,
How did that show up?
Well, there's this ad from the American Broadcasting Network in '57. It basically pictures the typical soap listener as an older woman.
Implying
the modern, busy, on-the-go housewife didn't have time for soaps anymore. It was like they were worried TV would pull women away from the domestic duties.
Wow, reflecting real social anxieties in an ad.
Definitely. But then CBS radio ads were still saying radio is best for reaching the audience who really listens, the housewife, because she could listen while working.
So radio's okay because it doesn't interrupt housework, but TV might.
That was the tension. Radio fits in. TV demands more visual attention, maybe disrupting the household routine. It taps into that whole panic about the changing role of women.
Interesting. And Erna Phillips, her stories often aimed to sort of help women reconcile with being at home, didn't they? While sometimes tackling social issues.
Yeah, she walked that line. Her narratives often reinforced domesticity, but also touched on bigger themes, though sponsors weren't always thrilled about the controversial stuff.
Right. Okay, let's talk about the look and feel. How did they try to make one show work aesthetically for both radio listeners and TV viewers? That sounds tricky.
It was a huge challenge. Remember Phillips's initial idea that daytime TV shouldn't be too visual because housewives wouldn't be glued to the screen.
Yeah.
But she did adapt. She started really studying how movement and positioning on screen could convey meaning. Like in a scene with Kathy and Dick, who's sitting versus standing, could show the power dynamic without much dialogue.
Subtle visual storytelling.
Exactly. And using things like characters turning their backs or close-ups to show internal thoughts, stuff radio did with voice tone or sound cues.
Clever. And the ads were totally separate.
Yeah, during the dual broadcast, the drama scripts were shared, but the ads were made specifically for radio or specifically for TV.
But they must have tried integrating ad into the TV show sometime.
Oh, for sure. There's a great example from January '53, an Ivory soap commercial.
Okay.
It had the show's doctor character talking about how gentle Ivory is for babies, and the visuals shifted from baby pictures to beautiful young women, implying they still used Ivory. Then the announcer brings it all back to the product.
Using the show's world to sell the product.
Exactly. Once the radio show ended, though, TV could really develop its own more focused visual style for Guiding Light.
This has been absolutely fascinating, really getting under the hood of that transition. So if we were to sum up the key takeaways from this deep dive.
Well, first, you can't ignore the economics. The huge costs, but also the massive opportunities of TV really drove decisions by P&G and the network.
Definitely.
Second, that relationship between the show and the audience fundamentally changed. Visibility, the rise of actor fandom.
Yeah.
It was a different world.
Yeah.
And third, just the sheer difficulty of creating something that worked for both ears and eyes simultaneously. It really highlights the challenges of adapting content across different media.
And it's so clear this wasn't just about technology changing. It reflected bigger things happening in society, didn't it? Especially around women's roles.
Absolutely. It's like an early version of the multi-platform challenges media faces today, trying to make content work everywhere.
So true. It really makes you think.
It does. And maybe the final thought for you listening is this. Guiding Light's long, complicated journey across radio and TV. What does that tell us about why serial stories endure? How do they adapt to new platforms, whether it's TV then or, streaming and social media now? What are those core things that keep an audience hooked no matter how they're watching or listening?
A great question to ponder. What really makes a story stick? Definitely something to think about.
Thanks for joining us on this journey through one of soap's most pivotal transitions. As the Guiding Light proved, stories can move across time and technology, but the connection they create with audiences never fades. And until next time, may your dial stay tuned and your stories stay strong.